think about the value of a post-mortem when it comes to what happened in an actual active shooter situation. And the odds are that many of us will never experience that. But how valuable would it be to speak with peers who have gone through those crisis situations?
Welcome to the RANE Insights podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. How is your organization's security? It's cybersecurity, physical security, or internal security? Do you have a chief security officer? If so, how does that person coordinate the many levels of security that your business needs? In this podcast, RANE founder David Lawrence learns some best practices from Joseph DeSalvo, the chief security officer at the Blackstone Group. He has more than 20 years of corporate security experience and a successful record of leading federal law enforcement and global risk management. His first rule of thumb, collaboration. Let's listen.
Joe, it's a great honor and privilege just to be able to have a conversation with you and, quite frankly, share with our audience the accumulated wisdom of your years of service, both at the FBI and a variety of private sector enterprises. And it's been my good fortune to stay in touch with you over these years. And without revealing too much about our respective ages, when you were younger and I was younger, the ability to work with you as a prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District was certainly one of my highlights, and the fact that we could stay in touch and continue to work together during our respective careers in the private sector has certainly been the unexpected surprise and, again, a privilege. So welcome today.
Thank you, David, and thank you for your comments and certainly all of the support that you provide not only to my team at Blackstone, but also across the Blackstone enterprise.
So I thought a good way to sort of begin would be an introduction. And if I find that you're being too humble, I'll jump in. But maybe you could just talk a little bit about your career at the FBI and then as you transition into the private sector, the different positions that you've had. And I think the context of that will be very important in terms of some of the insights that you'll be sharing with us today.
Sure, thank you. Well, I spent my years as an FBI special agent in the New York office where I worked on financial crimes and government fraud cases and had the good opportunity to work with many of the AUSAs in your department in the criminal division, and most notably on the retrial of a government official that had been convicted of paying kickbacks. I then had an opportunity to move on to Bankers Trust Company and run global financial crimes and anti-money laundering. After the acquisition of Bankers Trust by Deutsche Bank, I stayed on for a few years and ran that same program for the Americas. And then I moved on to Charles Schwab, where I was very fortunate to work for Charles Schwab, the founder and CEO, then CEO and chairman of Charles Schwab, to initially work on brokerage fraud and bank fraud after the acquisition of U.S. Trust, private bank here in New York, but then more broadly on the entire physical security, business continuity, and crisis management programs there. After that, I was very fortunate to be selected as Iron Mountain's inaugural chief security officer, so a relocation from San Francisco to Boston for me and my family, where I then built Iron Mountain's first enterprise-wide global security program. After that, after a few starts and stops at some other companies to focus on really mission-specific duties, most notably at Garda World, to be their chief security officer, to help them through the transition of their acquisition of 33 Bank of America cash vaults into the Garda World company. I was fortunate enough to get the offer to join Blackstone as its first chief security officer and help them build their program there.
And Joe, I'm going to take a moment just to make sure our audience is familiar. But one of the things that I found particularly unique about your career and what has, I think, given you that depth of experience and the insights that you have, is that you worked at companies that were actually, I'll call them precursors to the current landscape. And for example, there's a tremendous focus on fintech right now, and what I'll refer to are digital platforms, whether it's for payments, for broker-dealer, for banking, etc. Your position at Charles Schwab, Chuck, as many people refer to him, was really the first innovator in terms of online accounts and taking advantage of the digital world in terms of communications, making it cheaper and easier for people to invest money. So you were in that position before the term fintech existed, before the notion of data retention and cloud storage. You were at Iron Mountain, still is, I guess, the global leader in the protection of documents and records and preservation of that. And Garda, which is a global, company itself, which is responsible for the movement of money and assisting in payments and certainly the availability of cash and other types of things, but was a leading security firm around the payments area. So I, even before you got to Blackstone, my feeling is you sort of you saw the future and you got to experience it, and that's informed a lot of your thinking about risk management and business continuity and crisis management as well. Have you ever thought about your career, by the way, in those terms?
No, I haven't, but I think that's an interesting way to look at the progression of my career and the stops that I've made. Certainly, they're no coincidence. I think each step has built on the previous step. Certainly, when I was at Schwab, it was the height of what's known as the dot-com trading bubble in those years just prior to 9/11, and that led to an incredible strategy to do international acquisitions by Schwab, which had been primarily a domestic broker-dealer prior to that. And then with the acquisition of a world-class private bank, U.S. Trust, Schwab's operations really went from a broker-dealer entirely online to banking, which, as you know, the regulatory differences between a broker-dealer and a bank are quite significantly different. So we had to be very thoughtful about the security that we were providing to our customers and for the protection of the assets that we had that were entrusted to us by our customers. And then, of course, making sure that we were in compliance with the regulatory landscape. Moving on to Iron Mountain, that served me very well, as you quite rightly pointed out. Iron Mountain is the custodian of physical and electronic records for the world's most regulated companies: banking, insurance, medical. And of course, those organizations have a requirement to safeguard the information that their customers and their patients entrust to them. Just because a doctor's office or a bank gives that over to Iron Mountain to store in compliance with retention rules doesn't mean they can pass that risk to Iron Mountain. They have to be responsible for it. And so as they pass it to Iron Mountain, we needed to make sure that we were equipped from a security and technology perspective to safeguard that information and preserve the fiduciary responsibility that our clients were providing to their clients. And then, of course, Blackstone and Garda World. Again, Garda World, billions of dollars of cash inventory that is owned by retail banks, that is used to fill up their ATM machines and to provide cash currency to their retail customers. It's an awesome responsibility for Garda World and other armored carriers and cash vault operators to protect that while it's at rest in their cash vaults, but then when it's in transit, of course, increases the risk significantly as that currency is being used by the carriers to fill up ATM machines and deliver it to retail clients. And of course, Blackstone has an extensive amount of global private equity partners and residential communities where the safeguarding of that confidential business essential information is used for acquisitions and private equity transactions that have, there's no higher level of security for trade secrets and transactions that need to be applied anywhere else beyond those kinds of transactions.
So, Joe, I like the use of the term progression. Each sort of position that you had in your career sort of helped inform the next level of assignment. And very often, not only people have a certain view of a chief security officer, but even companies that hire know that they need a chief security officer may not agree on sort of the definition of that job and the roles and responsibilities. And because of the different positions you've had, and very often, the trusted relationship you had at the and still have at the highest levels, one of the efforts that we've had at RANE is to try to educate companies about the full spectrum of what a chief security officer can bring to the table and their roles and responsibilities. And I think, very often people have this preconception, which is a point of frustration for the men and women who are often hired out of the public sector, that it's about Glocks and locks, that it's a physical security position. It's about, alarms and access technology and things like that. And yet I've known, since my days at the U.S. Attorney's Office, when, we had a case with a corporation, that a chief security officer, the role, the responsibility, and most importantly, the talents that so very many of the men and women bring to the job can either be appreciated in its fullest spectrum and potential, or sometimes can be underappreciated or underinformed in terms of how that role is shaped. And so what I'd love to do, because of the different positions you've had, and I have firsthand knowledge of some of the wide spectrum of matters that you've been asked to help manage and handle, is maybe to have you speak a little bit about the role of the chief security officer, what it is, what it can be, and the types of skill sets that very often men and women can bring to bear to help manage risk, irrespective of the company or the industry, or even the region of the world in which operations occur.
Yes, I think, I think really the fundamental, most basic way to think about the role is to think about how an organization can fulfill its duty of care to its employees to protect the employees, the facilities, the assets, and the information of an organization. And that spectrum really covers the duty of care principle as it applies to employees, visitors, and clients when they're visiting, and clients that entrust their critical business information to you in order to transact whatever business you're doing with them.
And I assume, Joe, you'd also include stakeholders, the investors in a company as well.
Of course, limited partners and investors who are engaged in transactions with companies also are entrusting and placing an awful lot of trust in an organization when they turn over their information and investments to a company. So it's just essentially important that the chief security officer in this modern era be a business leader and help advise the businesses as they transact their business to manage the risk associated with whether it's on-site meetings or assets or information that is shared with them. It really has to be a fully holistic approach in the way organizations think about risk when it comes to security. And I think incumbent upon a security officer in the development of a strategy is really identifying the unique set of risks that exist for that company and for their business operations. No two private equity companies, no two banks share the same set of risks when it comes to their operations. Each organization is different, and I think what we've seen as a trend over the last decade is for the role of the security officer has become more complex. It's more collaborative with different stakeholders within an organization: legal, compliance, business operations, HR. And it's essential that there be very tight communications and collaboration between those groups. And then it doesn't end there. Collaboration with clients, investors is also essential. The line doesn't end when an investment is made or when somebody or a vendor is doing work to support your business operations. Really, there has to be strong collaboration between all of those groups to make sure that security is being achieved at all of the levels where it's necessary. And as we see in breaches every day, whether it's a breach of data, where somebody's personal information was compromised, whether it's an account takeover, and money has been diverted, or it's a safety and security issue when a visitor or a client is coming to an office space and then they encounter a dangerous situation, either in the lobby or in space. Disgruntled employees, domestic violence that creeps into the workplace, and of course, as we all know, sadly, the active shooter situations that seem to be accelerating in frequency.
No, Joe, at each of your positions, you've played an active role, I'll call it as a risk manager, assisting in what I'll refer to as the education and training to prevent certain situations from happening and for people to know what they need to do in those situations. And then in a phrase that has taken on increasing meaning, you've put together business continuity plans that in the event of a certain scenario, what does a company do, et cetera. And I love your reference to a collaborative process. And maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of how you have been working on a collaborative basis with, some of the chief risk officers inside a company, the business people themselves, suppliers, the vendors, and HR, to think about avoiding problems in the first instance, but also to make sure that there is a business continuity plan in place, whether it's because something happens at the company or something more exogenous to a particular city or location or possibly an industry.
That really is a very good point to focus on because, of course, one of the things the pandemic has done for organizations is give them visibility to the inadequacy, or if not inadequacy, inaccuracy of their business continuity plans. What do I mean by that? I think as organizations have gone through the process of documenting their business continuity plans, of course, they didn't have exactly real-world examples to validate their plans. Now, of course, there are some examples in the recent past. We have Hurricane Sandy for companies that were impacted in the Mid-Atlantic and New England, and of course, hurricanes from time to time. But I think what we've learned is that those situations were very different than a situation like this, where, quite interestingly, there was plenty of time actually to prepare for the work from home. As the pandemic spread west across Asia to Europe to the United States, there was plenty of time to prepare, plenty of time to get your most critical employees, let's say traders, set up at home to trade at home, give them the right equipment and screens and all of that. But I think once folks began to work from home, and it began to be 30 days to 60 days to 90 days now to 13 months and counting, some of the things that folks documented in their business impact analyses and their business continuity plans proved not to be accurate. Things that they thought were mission-critical processes turned out not to be. Things they didn't understand or document turned out to be disruptive and posed challenges. Let's give a very basic example. The ability to print at home in highly regulated companies, investment banks and banks, can be easily, and record phone calls, right, for trading activities. Those are things easy to do when folks are on the trading floor. You can regulate printing, you can restrict printing, you can record calls. Many companies were not prepared to have people print only things that they could print and needed to print in compliance with rules at home, or have the capability to do recording and have quality recordings of business transactions over the telephone at home. So I think it's interesting to look at the most basic, easy examples like the ones I just gave, and folks thought that those were so simple that they didn't plan around them, and they actually turned out to be the most challenging for organizations.
Joe, you've referenced pandemics, climate events, active shooters, and general safety and security. And I know broadly there's a term crisis management where you've been at the epicenter for various companies. And it could be a cyber event, it could be a threat against an executive, it could be a particular event at a plant. And one of the things, just again, for everyone's context, for people who are not familiar with Blackstone, which is one of the world's, if not the world's, leading private equity fund, it's actually it's a series of many different businesses and many different lines that, Joe, I know you've had various responsibilities for, but maybe you can talk to us about the role of the Chief Security Officer as a crisis manager and what that means.
I think over the course of a private sector career that's been now 20 years plus, of course, the many different shapes and sizes of crises have presented themselves over that time frame. You've named some of them quite rightly. It's natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes, disgruntled employees who have brought violence into the workplace, terrorist incidents like in Mumbai with the Taj Hotel bombing, of course 9/11, and other examples in other cities, coups in Turkey, and sort of all other shapes and sizes of crises. And the learnings from that is just really the criticality of collaborating with internal folks in all different departments to make sure that the needs of the organization are met as quickly as possible and in a comprehensive way. And practicing and being ready for those sorts of things is really so critically important. We know that thinking about, talking about, and running through different exercises and scenarios is really essential to good performance during an event. Let me give some examples. So any good business continuity program is going to have crisis management routine built into it. So the assignment of crisis teams at the enterprise level, at regional levels, at the business unit level, because there could be a crisis that affects one business unit but doesn't affect another business unit. So you never want to rely on a set of crisis leaders that don't understand the business operations or the region where the crisis is occurring. And once you have your infrastructure set up, you have to practice. And there's many different ways to do that, but at a minimum, presenting a good range of scenarios to your crisis leaders, your crisis teams, be it across physical security examples and cyber examples, is a good way to make sure that you could perform well. As I said earlier, many crises you don't have the luxury of being able to prepare for, like in the pandemic. We had about 3 to 4 weeks to prepare from working from home. So the crisis team was meeting and talking about that at large companies that have good muscle memory about this. But of course, in a terrorist attack or an active shooter situation, you don't have the luxury of being able to plan and think through things and engage outside counsel and engage outside experts. Your internal team needs to be ready to go. So you need to have on speed dial all of the people that you think and expertise that you think you'll need, whether it's internal or external, and you'll need to have practiced that. It's very difficult to connect to a conference bridge in a crisis, so people have had to have practiced it. They have to understand how they will be contacted in a moment's notice when something needs to occur. And so we've tried to provide a good array of practice for our crisis team, and really what we have seen is excellent performance by our crisis leaders, which includes all of the functional disciplines: HR, legal, compliance, corporate communications, external relations, public affairs, and of course our business operations leaders. The collaborative process has to include being able to get as much information as you possibly can about the organization, how it's impacting its people, how it's impacting its clients, how it's impacting its operations in those very first meetings. So it's been my view to hold twice a year scenarios, a physical scenario and then a cyber scenario, so that the team can be exposed to as many examples as possible. Of course, for regulatory purposes, it's really important that the guidelines be followed to make sure that your program documentation and your testing and exercise programs meet with regulatory compliance. In some cases, that will be the FFIEC. In other cases, it would be the SEC or whoever the primary regulator is. And so I think it's very important to collaborate with counsel and outside risk advisors to make sure that your program and your documentation is compliant, at least minimally, with the requirements. But not only that, that's not enough. You need to practice, and you need to make sure that your crisis leaders are able to respond and know what to do on a moment's notice.
Joe, having been on some of those calls and watched you lead the process of continuity and crisis communications, certainly one of the lessons I took away was that a crisis is a bad time to practice, and I saw that the benefits of earlier preparation seemed to bring people together and have a higher degree of confidence in terms of what had to be done. One of the things that I've observed as well in terms of how you think about risk and risk management is the work that and relationships that you continue to maintain with your peers at various companies, as well as the law enforcement community itself. A lot of lip service is paid to what I'll refer to as public and private sector initiatives and collaboration. But I think it'd be helpful if people understood a little bit about how you stay informed and how you're in a position to think through issues, hopefully before they occur, and warn people about them. But when there is an event, how you're able to respond. So just a bit about the importance, I'll call it the non-technology aspects of your job: relationship building, bridge building, and having a network of peers within the private sector, but also the relationships with the law enforcement community.
Of course, you said it well, David. I think the importance of collaborating with peers and with law enforcement is really essential to being able to successfully navigate any of the different things that would come across a chief security officer's radar in any given year. I've always stayed very close to the FBI, other federal law enforcement agencies, and local law enforcement agencies, both law enforcement as well as prosecutors, because it's important to have those relationships in place so that you can take counsel and advice from them when an incident occurs without having to fumble around and try to identify the right person to call. The importance of that really can't be overstated. And then one of the things that has been a great asset is collaborating with peers. There is a outstanding confidential collaboration platform that exists between us in the sort of global risk management profession, where we can be confident in sharing information with each other, and trust each other to not apply attribution to that, to where there could be, there's no confidential or trade secret information is shared. But for example, think of how important it has been to understand what return to office strategies are for peers and for other financial institutions and other industries. That's incredibly informative, not necessarily in your decision making, but to bring that back to your crisis team and be able to say, I've collaborated with law enforcement agencies and peers, and this is the way those organizations are thinking about returning to office, or this is how those organizations are thinking about workplace violence training for their employees, or this is how those organizations are thinking about active shooter situations for their employees, or here's the vendors that they've used. And not just the collaboration, David. Think about the value of a post-mortem data when it comes to what happened in an actual active shooter situation. And the odds are that many of us will never experience that. But how valuable would it be to speak with peers who have gone through those crisis situations, whether it's an earthquake, an active shooter situation, a workplace violence situation that's long-term and going on within an organization. That information is so valuable as you prepare your strategy, as you prepare your crisis team scenarios. And law enforcement is a great partner in that as well. The FBI will come in to exercises and meet with your crisis team, and their role might be as an outside advisor where they can only answer questions or comment when there's a phone call placed to them, but they're sitting in the room sharing real case examples of what they saw at other companies, whether it was a cyber breach or a crime of violence. And that is incredibly valuable. And so the relationships, both with peers, and with law enforcement is really incredibly valuable to preparedness.
So, Joe, hopefully you've been of help in expanding people's understanding of the chief security officer as being someone who goes well beyond physical security, is actually a risk manager, crisis manager, someone who figures prominently in terms of thinking through business continuity issues. I'd like to add one more thing to the sort of the job description, which is trusted confidant, because very often things can occur both within the walls of an organization or beyond the walls. Sometimes a personal matter involving a loved one, sometimes just a question about a potential transaction, directionally how to think about some things that may be weighing on the C-suite or their board. And maybe you can talk about, the role of the chief security officer as a trusted confidant in terms of decision making and in terms of some of the issues that, can arise that can have an impact on the business, but may not be part of the 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 or 9 to 7 hours, or the four walls of an office.
Yeah, that's really an excellent topic to explore. And I think David, it extends to both non-traditional asks from within a company to ones that impact sort of life outside of the office. Let me start with the first. In all of my private sector experiences, I think, and mine are unique because many of them I was appointed as the inaugural chief security officer of those organizations. So they didn't have prior experience or something to inform what that ought to look like. And I think you're right. I think when Someone comes in, they assume that is the guns, guards, and alarms, to use that phrase, and it is. In many cases, those are the things that are the basic blocking and tackling, and controlling access at the lobby level, controlling access at the floors, preventing risk from entering the building, right? That's the guns, the guards, and the alarms, preventing intrusions and all of that stuff. But, I think it's relationships and positive outcomes that help the business to see the additional value, which I would argue exceeds the value that the guns, guards, and alarms programs can be to an organization. But that's important. I'm not undermining that, right? The facilities have to be secure so that employees and visitors are safe and secure in the workplace. That's basic security 101. But I think as I have been engaged in all of my organizations in looking into a threat that might have come in by email or was left on someone's voicemail or came in a letter, hard copy letter, or a comment that a disgruntled employee made when he or she was being terminated. I think the value of the output of what we do then becomes more visible to people in thinking about how that level of analysis and thoughtfulness and recommendations that come into managing that risk present really very differently than what the sort of what the regular perception is of a security department. And so as you do that, as you provide those kinds of things, people recognize, you know what? I begin to get calls a year into all of the previous jobs that I mentioned, say, you know what, Joe, we're doing this deal in Turkey or in Brazil. Yeah, we've got our outside counsel and our outside accounting firm, our Big Four firm. We know the financials in and out. We've evaluated the financial statements, the business opportunity. We know what the growth looks like. But can you help us think about what kinds of brand risk might we be taking on by doing work in this jurisdiction? Are there things that the introduction of an American brand in these jurisdictions bring that we haven't thought about in our diligence preparations with lawyers and accountants? Are there travel considerations? We're going to be traveling there a lot more frequently from the US. What kinds of things do we need to be thinking about that? All of those things are things that many organizations don't think about. They don't think about all of the categories of risk. Of course, it's in their muscle memory to think about financial risk and looking at what the business projections are. But it is really something that I have seen as a repetitive pattern in the roles that I've been in. And David, those then evolve into what you also said. There might be other activities that involve family members, travel by family members, or circumstances that a parent or child encounter that enter into the dialogue where people will call you as a trusted advisor and say, you know what? My son was off at college, or my mom is going off on a trip to the Middle East or to South America, and Joe, we'd really like your counsel and advice because there was this business example a year or two ago where we got great value out of the research and advice that you gave. So I do think people are beginning to think about security in a much different way than it had been traditionally thought about. And security officers, I think, have a lot to offer individuals, executives, and organizations as they transact business, both in their business life and in their personal lives.
Joe, thanks. And what should be obvious to the audience, and I know is obvious for the various places where you worked, so much of the role of the chief security officer, and we can talk about the wide range of things that you've been asked to manage and respond to, but all this also adds up to also serving as a steward or a guardian of, you use the word of the brand, I'll use the word of reputational risk management and helping to preserve the reputation of a firm. obviously, when things are not handled correctly, and I don't care whether it's within the cyber realm, it could be, an act of physical violence, it could be civil unrest and the increasing number of demonstrations that companies are subjected to. It could deal with the behavior or the travel, or, as you said, something that goes wrong with an investment in a particular location. This also all adds up to reputational protection. And I love the description you gave about the continued learning and continued information flow, intelligence flow from maintaining a network within other people, within other firms, with the professionals who manage security, as well as with law enforcement, which is often misconstrued. It is there, believe it or not, notwithstanding enforcement proceedings. So much of what law enforcement and various regulatory agencies try to do is to prevent the problems and are often very, very giving. So I'll end with one note. Wherever Joe has worked, various people within that sector, that industry, or even unrelated industries knew they could reach him to pick his brain, and that became a two-way street. Similarly, when law enforcement had a question or needed something, they knew they didn't have to drop a subpoena on a particular organization. They could pick up the phone and begin to navigate that with Joe, and Joe knew how to handle information appropriately, and if a subpoena was necessary, so be it. But that also created a two-way street where Joe was able to pick up the phone. And those are often the things that are not necessarily recognized and appreciated in terms of the role of the Chief Security Officer. So, Joe, thank you so much for sharing both your background, your approaches, the insights, and we look forward to continuing contributions. And obviously, we're collaborating with you on a number of fronts. So that's been a great privilege and honor as well. So thanks again for spending time, Joe.
Thank you, David.
Individuals and organizations turn to RANE for risk intelligence that cuts through the hype to focus on what they need to know, what to expect, and what to do. The hub of RANE's service is the democratization of information and expertise. Subscribe to RANE's core membership and let us power your business to success. Learn more at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.